This video been a long time in the works. Mostly I'm still trying to figure out a bunch of things, but this is about shear scraping. Shear scraping, this is my finish cut on all of my bowls. I use it on spindles as well. Started working this basically after watching Jimmy Clues, and he made the comment that he uses the shear scrape on all of his bowls because when you use a bevel rubbing cut, it actually burnishes the surface. And the first thing you have to do when you start sanding is you've got to sand away all that burnishing. And I think some of that amount of burnishing that happens depends on how hard you're rubbing the bevel, because yes, the bevel should rub the wood, but the wood shouldn't know it. But I definitely do like it, and the best thing it's for is you take out all those fine little tool marks that you have to sand out, or you can spend a little bit of extra time cutting them out. Now, the very term shear scrape I have found confusing since day one. If you're familiar with me, you know that I am a self-proclaimed scraper psycho. That's difficult to say. Use them more than most people do, and to me this is not a scraping cut in any way, shape, or form. So to me, a scraping cut means pretty much that the cutting edge is at 90 degrees to the spin of the wood. So with scrapers flat on the tool rest, and the wood is spinning straight into or at a 90 degrees angle to the cutting edge. And if you notice how it's kind of white there, this is the part where you're cutting uphill and you get tear out that way. So this is being done with a gouge. I have seen people refer to this as a shear scrape. To me, this is still basically a scraping cut because your cutting edge is at 90 degrees to the wood. And this might actually be closer to using a negative rake scraper because you've got pretty much an angle on both sides there. So why do they call it a shear scrape? The only answer I've been able to find out on that one is basically, well, you're not rubbing the bevel. So to me, what does rubbing the bevel have to do with anything? It is a slicing cut. It is a high-angled slicing cut. And chatting with Lyle Jameson, Lyle insists that you spell it S-H-E-E-R. Most other people spell it S-H-E-A-R. So shears are, like cutting this way, or I was thinking wind shear. I'm in the middle of a thermal in my hang glider. The wind's going up. The wind on the outside static, which basically means your tool resting on the tool rest. But I was asking Lyle about the shear, S-H-E-E-R, and I'm thinking it's very, very light, almost see-through because the shavings are that thin. And I said, so Lyle, is this like a negligee? And I got the mother of all eye rolls from Lyle, and he goes, no, it's like the sheer face of a cliff. And I thought about that, and that does make a lot of sense. So basically, you want a high cutting angle rather than a square scraping angle. And what that high cutting angle does, it's kind of like hitting the speed bumps in the parking lot with your car. If you hit them square on, that's like a scraping cut, and you can get a pretty good bump. It's not going to be clean and smooth. Hit that speed bump at a 45-degree angle, and that speed bump smooths way out. There's still a bump there, and you get up to 60, 70 degrees, and you almost don't feel it at all. So what that means is that the steeper the angle is, the easier it is for the cutting edge to get under the fibers and lift them as they cut, rather than just pulling them, which is what a scraping cut is. So these are fairly typical shavings that I get when I am cutting wet wood. If I'm cutting dry wood, they're much finer, much more wispier type, almost float in the air. These are not typical of shavings that I can get when I'm just using a standard scraper. So when it comes to favorite tools for doing the shear scraping, of course I do everything with scrapers. Some people prefer gouges, and I'll get into gouges a little bit here later on. As far as I'm concerned with metals, there are two choices: the M42 high-speed steel, or like the V10. So basically it's Dave Schweitzer, the D-Way, or Doug Thompson with the V10. There are a couple other sources out there. And yeah, Doug and Dave, I'm sorry, I've got a Dave handle here and a Doug tool. But recently went back to an M2 high-speed steel for a gouge. I wanted to try the flute shape and couldn't figure out why I was having problems with it cutting, and finally figured it out that it just goes dull that much quicker. So these definitely keep their edges a whole lot longer. So these are favorite profiles. This used to be my standard go-to for the outside shear scraping. A long sweep back on it. I don't use this one as much anymore. Main thing is I'd start off my shear scrape here, long wing, and as I came out towards the end, I'd be up on the nose there, which worked, but I found out sometimes I'd have that edge actually down into the steel on the tool rest. So this is my preferred outside shear scraper right now. So not quite a spear point tool. This does have a little bit of an arc to it. And with this one I can go to the right or I can go to the left, either way. Doesn't make any difference. And the reason I don't go to the spear point, that point can be kind of difficult to use or kind of grabby and catchy. And so this is actually a skew chisel. This is not a shear scraper, so got the bevel on both edges. And I've seen a few shear scrapers that are made like this for doing the outsides, which are straight like that, and they are okay, but the thing I would worry about with them, you start on the heel, that's fine, but if you get up and try to cut with that point, your tool is not balanced anymore. And just like if you're using a skew chisel on a spindle and you try to cut with a point, bam, it slams down on you. So that's why I only go halfway up, then you can't get above that center line. Okay, so these are my inside shear scrapers. So basically a little bit flatter arc on this. Both of these, that's the V10, that's the M42. I like this more for flatter forms. The more rounded ones will work better inside deeper bowls. And if you're only going to have one shear scraper, if you have a round nose like this, actually this one too, these can both be used inside and outside. The specialized outside ones will not work inside a bowl. Okay, so shear scraping, basically you're pulling off all these little tool marks, all the little bumps and ripples that you leave when the gouge is not working quite up to par. And of course the next question that comes up is what kind of edges do you like on them? My preference, I started off just going off the 80 grit CBN wheel, leaves a nice big heavy burr, and that works. And I've started playing around with a number of different edges. I do like a 180 grit or an old broken in 80 grit wheel. That'll take care of most of the cutting that you do. If you go to 600 grit or 1000 grit, which I have, those work very nicely if you've got something that's being very difficult, like something that's kind of punky and wants to tear, or if you've got some very highly figured wood, so it makes a very, very fine edge. I've never done the hand honed type burrs on them, especially now that I've got a 600 and 1000 grit CBN wheel. They do a better job of raising that type of burr. I have tried where I hone the burr totally off, so there's no burr at all, hone both the bevel and the top of it. That does okay, but I'm starting to lean a lot more now towards the hone it off than hand burnish it. And I touch on that a little bit in my sharpening video, and I'll probably add a little clip on that in at the end of this. But that burnish burr, it's more durable than the grinder burrs. You can turn it down, raise it back up a couple of times before you have to take it back to the grinder. And most of the time when I'm using this cut, I've found that a pull cut is far easier than a push cut. Don't know why, it's just the one that feels better. Okay, so to do the shear scrape, basically I'd take the tool, roll it till it starts to do a bevel rubbing cut, and then roll it just a little bit more. You don't want to roll it way over, because then the cutting edge, instead of lifting, is actually working like claws. It's called a trailing cut, and you're going to tend to pull more. So take it, roll it till it just starts to do a bevel rubbing cut, and then do your shear scrapes. Okay. So that's bevel rubbing right there. Tip it just a little bit more. Very light cuts. You can push and pull because this cut's so light. Move the tool rest. Got a little bit of run out in the blank there from not doing a good job with my gouge. The shear scraping is also an excellent tool for getting rid of almost every single bit of run out you have on a piece of wood. Nice wispy shavings. So I don't know if you can see the color change here where it's kind of white. That is basically we're running uphill, we're running against the grain. This does not get rid of every single bit of tear out, but it does get rid of most of it. So next step, I'm going to take out the tear out on this part here. So again, a shear scrape here, instead of being way down, because the wood is spinning this way, I'm going to be at still about that 70 degrees or so, like that. A few very light passes. Get rid of most of it. It'll take a little bit more out there. That's got just about all the tear out there. We'll take and turn this burr down. So push like that. Burr's gone. Bring the burr back up. Take another pass or two. I do think you get a slightly better burr if you hone the grinder burrs off and then burnish, but it still works. So this is my going uphill part. A little tiny bit of tear out there, but not much. So next, I'm going to clean up my recess. This bowl sat overnight, so I've got to true this recess up a little bit. Bouncing a little bit. Now that is a pretty rough surface in there. For doing this part, I'll use a bevel rubbing cut. For doing this part, I actually do a shear scrape, and the idea with the shear scrape, since you aren't rubbing the bevel, basically you trim off all the high spots and low spots, and you end up with a pretty close to dead true surface. Biggest difference that makes is when you reverse it, it runs almost dead true. So I am not rubbing the bevel there. With this one I am. And then clean up my bevel. This is just a straight plunge cut. That is ready to reverse. This is experimental, so just see how much run out there is in it before I turn it around. So we have a pencil line a little bit shallow right here. We'll see what happens when I turn it around and how good of a job I did. Speed down. So this was the line before I reversed it. This is the line after I reversed it. They're not too bad. And what I do like with the shear scraping, and this is only important if you're doing bowls that are 1/8 of an inch or less thick, this is the best way for truing up the outside so there's almost no run out. Because whenever you rub the bevel, you always get a little bit of that bump. And with the shear scrape, since you're not rubbing the bevel, you're not getting that bump, and you're basically trimming off the high sides. So just touching this up a little bit. Take another pass over that part. Yeah, put a little heavier line on there so it's easier to see. Wet wood doesn't mark as well. But you can see from that pencil line that's running pretty much dead true. Okay, so this is my tear out zone from running uphill, running against the grain, and you can see some lines in there and how the color changes. So same thing on this side, and what the idea with the shear scraping is it will pull out the lines and reduce the tear out. So this is one of the V10 gouges, V10 scrapers, excuse me. Very gentle pull cut. Nice thin shavings. Okay, so this is my tear out zone. There and there, so most of those lines are gone, most of the color change is gone. I'll do a little bit more from here on up. Very gentle pull cut. So that's all pretty clean. One note of caution here, and if you watched all my videos, there's the one where I'm using the big ugly tool, which is on the square shaft. I was shear scraping the rim like this. I came across, wasn't paying attention, but I got on the high side of it, got out to about here, kabam. So if you're shear scraping this rim, make sure you stay on the low side. Don't try to get on the high side of that. Don't ever get above center where it's going to slam over on you. Now, for going across the bottom, the shear scrape works, kind of. The problem is really, really difficult to keep it steady going across the flat. For some reason or other, I don't have the problems coming up the sides. And so sometimes for that, I'm switching to a negative rake scraper, or just a plain scraper with a burr honed off. I am moving with my body here. See what that left me with. Not too bad. I've got a hump there. I'll see if I can pull that off with this. So you can see the rings, and that happens when you're trying to go on a flat surface. Doesn't happen coming up the walls. I don't know why. So I switched tools. So if we're going across the bottom, this is pretty much just a standard scraper, 70-degree bevel, very light burr or no burr. The thing with scrapers, when you're going down through the grain, it's going to want to tear out a lot more. But if you're in pretty much flat grain, just sweeping back and forth across the bottom, it can leave a pretty nice surface. So yeah, it is cheating, but it works. And that leaves a much better surface. Yeah, still got a hump there. I'll take that out. And that's pretty much it for shear scraping. There's all sorts of variations, and as I said, I do prefer the burnish burr. We're going to try a few comparative cuts so we can see if the camera can actually see the differences between like a burnish burr or off of a finer grit CBN wheel. Okay, so we're going to see if we can compare two cuts. I don't know if you can see how rough that is or not. This side has been sharpened on a pretty much brand new 80 grit CBN wheel. This side's been sharpened, if you can actually see that shiny spot there, honed the burr off and then burnished the burr on it. So we'll take this half with the 80 grit and this half with the burnished burr. So that's with the 80 grit, this is with the burnished burr. So, nasty spot. It's cleaned up on the outside okay. I really don't see a whole lot of difference with this. You can see here it's a little shinier than it is on this one. I'm going to take a little bit deeper cuts and go all the way up to the pencil line, see if that makes any difference. Got more tear out there than I expected to have. I'll see what it does with a VT. Okay. This is the really nasty spot here. Since this is fairly deep, I'm going to use the Big Ugly tool, which is a coarser edge. I should take a little bit more off of it. That got some of it. So this is a V10. Don't even know what this one was sharpened on. The previous surface I had on there was roughed up with the Big Ugly in a straight scraping mode. And I had tear out in there that was too deep to pull out with a shear scrape, because shear scrapes don't pull off much metal. So the nasty spot there, you can feel a little bit of tear out, you can't see it. So this is M42 steel. This is burnished burr. I'll take it back this way. I don't expect there to be a lot of difference. Between the two metals, I really can't tell that either one of them has an advantage over the other one. But they're both a lot better than M2. So this is my really nasty spot. There's still a little bit of tear out. The surfaces are comparable. So yes, I do use scrapers on everything. Nice piece of sugar maple here. Got some fairly nasty tear out there. My Skew skills or lack thereof. This makes a good cleanup cut for getting out tool marks. So again, I'm not rubbing the bevel. So, and that tear out is gone. A lot of people prefer gouges for shear scraping. I do everything with scrapers. The thing I don't like about them is in order to get it to start cutting, you have to roll the flutes over till you can't really see where you're cutting, kind of covers the cut. It still works. I don't know if it's any better or any worse than these scrapers. They both work. If there is any difference between a gouge and a scraper using for shear scraping, the only thing that I think could make any difference is this angle between the wing and the flutes is much more acute than the angles on the scraper. But again, I really can't tell any difference on the finished surfaces, so 6 of one, half dozen the other to me. So this was my nasty spot for the tear out, or the nastiest spot. This side was done with a gouge, this side was done with a shear scraper. Maybe a very slight color difference up here for tear out, but the surfaces feel pretty much identical. Not a whole lot of difference between them. And that's pretty much it for shear scraping. Okay, this is a teaser or trailer because I want to do one on negative rake scrapers and I'm still figuring them out. The two key points that seem to finally connected with something in my brain, so I'm kind of understanding them. One, this is a high maintenance tool, which means you have to sharpen it a lot because it goes dull very quickly. And it might have been Tom Worsing that told me that one, but he was definitely one that told me that if you have to push on it at all, that means your edge is dull. Which to me is if you barely touch the face of the wood and you're getting shavings, and if you're touching the face of the wood and you're not getting shavings, then that means your tool is dull. And I'll show you kind of how that process goes. But as I go across here, I'll sweep and I'll be all the way over the other edge, and it will be dull by the time I get to the end. And that burr is gone. So that's why it's a high maintenance tool. Nice fluffy shavings.